The late autumn chill bit into the city's streets, sharp enough to make even the wealthiest of souls pull their coats tighter. Inside the corner diner, the warmth of the worn booths and the scent of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee seemed to offer an unspoken invitation to anyone seeking comfort from the cold. The hum of conversation and clinking of dishes filled the space, but it was the sight of her Helen that always caught Luke Jackson's eye. At 29, Luke had everything a man could want: a fortune earned from his tech startup, an impressive penthouse, and a world of connections that offered him anything but peace. He sat at the counter, his gaze lingering on Helen as she moved through the diner with a grace that belied the chaos of the bustling morning. She was just a waitress, no more than a whisper of simplicity in the whirlwind of his life. But to Luke, there was something in her quiet presence that he couldn't ignore. Helen, 25 and full of warmth, treated everyone the same. Whether it was a regular who ordered the same coffee every morning or a businessman in an Armani suit, she never showed any difference in her demeanor. It was a trait that Luke, with all his wealth and power, had never encountered. The disparity between their worlds was evident, yet it felt as though something invisible connected them. Something that made Luke wonder if there was a part of him, hidden beneath his expensive suits and cold interactions, that craved the very simplicity Helen embodied. But his world had taught him to question everything. People were too eager to flatter him, too quick to nod and smile when his name came up in conversation. Money, it seemed, made people desperate for his attention, and he hated it. That's when the thought crossed his mind: is Helen different? Or was she just like everyone else, seeing a paycheck in his presence? It was a temptation he couldn't ignore. Luke began to visit the diner more frequently, observing her from his seat. His interest grew not just because of her beauty or the kindness she radiated, but because of her complete lack of pretense. She didn't seem interested in his money, his status, or anything he could offer her. But how could she not know? He was always surrounded by expensive clothes, the latest gadgets, and an aura of privilege. So, he decided to test her. It was an idea born out of both cynicism and curiosity. Luke had seen enough to know that trust was something earned, not given, especially in a world as transactional as his. He began to plan his test. The next time he walked into the diner, dressed in the finest wool coat and a tailored suit, he looked at Helen as if she were a puzzle to be solved. But this time he didn't sit down at his usual booth. Instead, he left, walking a few blocks to a nearby alley where he discarded the suit, pulling on a worn jacket and adjusting his appearance. His hair was now unkempt, his face stubbled, and he let the cold work its magic on his body, making him appear more ragged than he was. He looked like a beggar, an ordinary man with no riches, no power, and no story but the one the world had written for him. With a deep breath, Luke returned to the diner, stepping inside, cold air swirling with him as the door opened. He slouched against the counter, casting a furtive glance at Helen, who was taking orders at the other end. She caught sight of him, and immediately her demeanor shifted from professional to something warmer, softer. "You look cold," she said, her voice full of concern before taking a step closer. "Would you like some coffee? It'll warm you up." Luke's heart twisted in his chest. "Just water," he muttered, playing his part. Helen didn't hesitate. She nodded and moved to fetch it, her kindness unwavering. The way she treated him without hesitation, without judgment, left Luke speechless. He watched her every move, trying to piece together what made her different. Her kindness wasn't forced. It wasn't a performance for tips or approval. She treated him like he was someone worth caring about, even though he looked nothing like the man who usually sat in her section. There was no suspicion, no hesitation, only genuine concern. It was so simple, so pure, that it made Luke uncomfortable. As days passed, he returned to the diner, each time in the same disguise, each time observing her. She never faltered. Helen's kindness seemed to be a constant in a world that Luke had grown to see as false. She served others with the same unfiltered generosity, whether they were regulars who knew her name or complete strangers. One morning, as the weather turned colder, Luke found himself standing outside the diner, pretending to struggle against the biting wind. His stomach rumbled. It had been hours since his last meal. He saw Helen through the glass, moving around the kitchen, her face lit by the warm light inside. He stood there longer than usual, not just testing her, but also battling something within himself, a nagging feeling of guilt for putting her through this. Then he saw her notice him. Helen's gaze softened when she spotted him shivering outside. She didn't look at him with pity. It was concern, pure and simple. Without a word, she walked outside, a thermos of coffee and a slice of warm pie in her hands. "Here," she said, handing him the food and drink. "I thought you might be hungry." Luke's breath caught in his throat. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. He stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. She was offering him warmth when he had done nothing to earn it. He had been cruel, pretending to be something he wasn't, yet here she was, offering kindness freely. "Thank you," he finally managed, though the words felt insufficient. He wanted to tell her the truth, to confess his deception, but the words stuck in his throat. He could only nod and walk away, feeling the weight of the lie he'd built between them. Days passed, and Luke continued his visits, each one more difficult than the last. His guilt was suffocating. Every time Helen smiled at him, every time she went out of her way to offer him food or a warm drink, he felt as though he were betraying something pure. His tests were supposed to confirm that she was genuine, but instead they only confirmed the depth of his own shame. Then, one evening, as he sat at the counter nursing his usual coffee, he overheard a conversation between Helen and a customer sitting near her section. The man, who seemed to be a few years older than Luke, was ranting about an ex-girlfriend who had ruined his life. He was bitter, his words bitter too, dripping with contempt. "That woman," he spat, "she was too good for me, always looking down on me, always playing the martyr, thinking she could fix everyone around her. I couldn't stand it." He paused, catching his breath. She was nothing but trouble. Luke's curiosity piqued. He noticed the way Helen's expression tightened as the man spoke. She didn't interrupt, didn't react to his words. But her eyes were a mixture of anger and sorrow, a storm of emotion just beneath the surface. Later, when the diner emptied out for the night, Helen quietly closed the door and turned the sign to closed. Luke watched her, feeling an overwhelming urge to speak to her, to understand her better. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his heart raced. Helen turned to him, her face softer now, the harshness from the earlier conversation fading. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Just a little, past baggage, nothing I can't handle." Luke's curiosity flared, and without thinking, he asked, "You don't have to tell me, but what's the deal with that guy? He seemed pretty harsh on you." Helen hesitated. There was a moment of vulnerability in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "He was a boyfriend a while ago. He's just bitter, I guess." She shrugged, but Luke could see the deep hurt in her eyes, the weight of someone who had endured the cruelty of another. "You deserve better than that," Luke said before he could stop himself. His words were honest, raw, and he meant them more than he cared to admit. Helen chuckled softly, though the humor didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks, but I'm used to it. People like him, they just see the kindness and take advantage of it. It's my fault for letting it happen." Luke swallowed hard. He couldn't help but feel the sting of that statement, a mirror to his own actions, his own deceit. "You didn't deserve that," he said, his voice quieter now, the mask of the beggar slipping away as his true self began to resurface. For a moment, there was silence between them, thick with unspoken understanding. Then, Helen gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm just tired of people who don't appreciate what's real. You know?" Luke nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. But he also knew that this was the moment. He couldn't hide any longer. "I need to tell you something," Luke said suddenly, his voice trembling with both regret and relief. He stood up, gathering the courage that had been missing from his life for too long. Helen looked at him, her face unreadable. "What is it?" "I'm not who you think I am," he began, his heart pounding. "I've been coming here for weeks, pretending to be someone I'm not. A beggar. I wanted to see if you were kind to me because of who I am or because of who you are. But the truth is, I've been hiding behind a lie." Helen blinked, taking a step back. Her face turned pale, and her eyes flashed with disbelief and hurt. "You what?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry," Luke said, his voice hoarse. "I should have told you the truth from the start, but I was afraid. Afraid of being treated like everyone else. Afraid of my wealth being the only thing that matters." For a long moment, Helen didn't say anything. Her eyes searched his face, trying to make sense of what he had just confessed. Then, with a small, sharp intake of breath, she spoke. "You lied to me," she said, her voice low and steady. "You used me for some test, and now you expect me to just forgive you." Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I trusted you." Luke's chest tightened and he couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "I never wanted to hurt you. But I see now how much I've hurt you. I should have never done this, and I can't take it back. But I want to make things right." Helen stood there frozen for what seemed like an eternity. Then, slowly, she took a deep breath, and when she spoke again, her voice was soft. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Luke, but we can start fresh. No more tests, no more lies. Just us, being honest with each other." Luke nodded, feeling a small measure of relief as he looked at her, knowing they had a long road ahead. But at least now there was a real chance for something true to grow between them. So if you love the story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.